Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about having unique rules for players. And this is me answering a question from Shy Robot, who asked, in many RPGs, it feels like the player is governed by different rules than the rest of the world and its NPCs. What game systems and design processes do you think really close this division? Let me just say, Shy Robot, I know what you're talking about, and it is an interesting question because not everybody agrees on even what you mean by the rules and what players can have and NPCs can have, and whether they even agree that players shouldn't have unique rules. So let's dive into that. First of all, I know what you mean. I've played many RPGs, I'm just going to talk about RPGs here, where NPCs have no abilities or seemed shocked by abilities that are common in their world. Like the player uses a spell and they're like, ah. Or there's a ghost. They live in a fantasy world and there's a ghost and they seem shocked by that. Or the NPCs seem to be immune to certain kinds of damage, like they don't set off traps, or if they do, they don't take damage from it, or they're not targeted by monsters, or monster AoEs don't affect them. Many, many RPGs have that, but some don't. So, and by the way, just a quick heads up, there are many players that don't mind this. Some even kind of like it. They're like, those creatures are there for me to attack. Those traps are there for me to disarm and avoid. Also, I want to explain that some of the things I'm going to talk about aren't 100% avoidable. I don't think you can or should make a game that behaves exactly the same for the player as it does for the NPCs. And I'm probably going to get a little bit pedantic about this, but I think that's important to talk about. So let me get into it. First of all, I think you should try as hard as you can to make one set of rules that applies for both players and non-players. And that includes creatures, monsters, not just other people in your game. And this means that take a look at skills and abilities that people can have. So your NPC should be able to throw spells or use items or do a lot of the things that the player is doing because that's part of the world. In combat, they should be able to use armor or weapons and get bonuses from them. So if this, weapon lets them shoot twice as fast, they should start using twice as fast. If this armor makes them harder to hit or makes them, semi-transparent because it's camouflage armor, they should go semi-transparent, just like the player does. I think it's fun. I think it adds a lot of cool variety to NPCs. And also, especially if you let NPCs pick things like that up in the environment, then when you kill one NPC and they drop their weapon, if another NPC picks it up, that's really cool and really adds a lot of cool variety. Dialogue's a little tougher because most dialogue skills are you somehow doing an influence over the NPC, which when I talk about what players don't like is one of the many things players don't like having happen to them. But you can view things like the skill checks for, say, the player lying. Those skill checks getting higher is kind of implying that the NPCs are getting better perception and they're being able to see through your lies. So it's harder to lie to them. So you can view that as, here's how we define how conversations work, and this is the back and forth between NPC and players. But I understand dialogue is frequently going to be a special case because until we have completely generative dialogue is a fixed thing that's written by people before the game ever shipped. So, with all that, let me just say that it is perfectly okay and reasonable, and in fact somewhat expected, for the player to be special in some way. In Pillars, the player was a watcher, and so they had the ability to see and speak to dead people. In the Outer Worlds, the player had brain damage, and that was the explanation of why they could slow down time in combat. Now, both of those things were limited. They couldn't do it anywhere they wanted, whenever they wanted. But what I like is there's something in the setting or the system mechanics that's explaining why the player can do something that no one else in the world can do. And that also reinforces why the player is story driven. Why is the player so central to the story? Because it's one of those, hey player, you're our only hope. You're the only one who can kill these dragons. You're the only one that can do this thing. You're the only one who can see this thing. It helps make the player feel special, which is not a bad thing. Also, I'm going to point out, and this is where I think I'm going to get pedantic, there are some player special abilities that are unavoidable because they are players. Pausing the game. NPCs can't do this. They can't just say, okay, when everything halt, until this NPC's ready. Players do that all the time. You pop up, you hit a button, bring up the main menu, pause the game because you want to go do something. Basically, anytime the time isn't passing, which means if you leave the game and time stops passing, which it does in pretty much every single player game, that's weird, and that's a special player ability. You may not see it that way, but let's take a look for a second at save games, or if your game has checkpoint saves instead of save anywhere. Both of those are things that NPCs can't do, that the player can do, which means you can you can make a save, try something, go, reload, try something else, reload, try something else. NPCs can't do that. We talked about adding a boss like that in the game that Fallout became, back when it was a sci-fi dinosaur time travel game. We had a boss who had save games. It was tough. It was a tough sell. There's also things you have to realize that they may not be 100% avoidable, but many players expect them to be there. Fast travel is an example. If you watch my video on that, there were people in the comment section saying, I won't play a game without fast travel. And other people going, I hate fast travel. I wish they just designed not to need it. You can design not to need fast travel. And there's a lot of player abilities like that you don't see as a player ability because it's not a skill or a spell. But when you go to the map and you can fast travel, that's something only you seem to be able to do. A game can be designed not to have fast travel, but just remember that you're saying you want extra work. That means that the world should be designed for the lack of fast travel. And as many of you pointed out, that means that quests need to give you enough clues to find something. They need to describe its location, landmarks. You have to be able to find it without just being able to fast travel to it. That going back and forth between two locations should be interesting. There should be things that happen and things to do. Otherwise, just walking back and forth between towns and dungeons and caves will get very boring very fast. So if you don't want some features like that, you have work cut out for you. You have to do design work, and then you have to do implementation work that you may have not had to do if you had included some of those features. So that's just things to think about. And then finally, there are some things that absolutely should exist in your game, but they don't because players hate it. And this is why I sometimes say realism isn't fun. Players don't like permanent death. There are a few games that provide it. In general, players don't like, oh, you got low in health and then that NPC shot an arrow into your knee and you died. Too bad for you. Restart the entire game from the beginning. Things like not allowing non-companion NPCs to be resurrected. This is something that so many games that have resurrection spells don't let you do. I don't think Baldur's Gate 3 let me do it. And I had that issue in the original Baldur's Gate, where I was playing a cleric and I had a raise dead spell, and some farmer was looking for their kid and the kid had died. And the kid had died recently. I should have been able to raise that kid. Game just said no. Which is weird. I live in a world where resurrection exists and the ability is given to me and I can't do it. Game says no. Sometimes these don't exist because it would so disrupt the storyline. You're trying to find who killed an NPC. I'll just raise them. You're trying to escort someone safely and they get killed. I'll just raise them. We let you do this in Arcanum, and we had to do a lot of extra work to make sure the game recognized when an NPC died and when they were raised, and what effect that would have on quest states. I have a whole video on Arcanum quest states. It's a very interesting video and includes things like this. By the way, as a side note, if your game has player versus player PvP combat, as opposed to just player versus environment PvE combat, I also like this rule of not having separate abilities in each one of those. So make the abilities work the same way. And I've mentioned this, and some people didn't like that, but let me just point out two things if you're thinking about doing this. First, many players don't like being given PvP only skills, because if they don't do player versus player gaming, if they don't take part in that, which it's often an optional thing, you just gave them something that's worthless that fills up their player sheet that they will never use. And you actually make them feel a little bad too. Similarly, players don't like skills that work one way against NPCs and another way against players. Skills that basically change when you enter PvP. This can be very confusing, especially I played this game for years, then I go into PvP and it's like, what? These don't work, or they work differently. It's just very confusing. And just so you know, in many MMORPGs that have both PvP and PvE, the latter is way more popular. And I'm talking sometimes an order of magnitude more popular. Like 10 times as many people are playing PvE than playing PvP. So unless you design your game to be primarily PvP, and the PvE is just something extra they can do, most people are going to ignore or avoid the PvP. However, having said all this, another thing you need to remember is that most, and I almost want to say all, but I'll just say most, players hate certain effects on themselves that they love to see happen to NPCs. Here's some examples. Knocking an NPC unconscious. Paralyzing an NPC. Charming an NPC, so then they join you and fight for you. Stealing items on an NPC. All those things I just mentioned, players hate when it happens to them, but they love doing that effect on NPCs. So you may go, well, how can I include those and not have this division between player and NPC? Well, you can replace a lot of those with things that would work on both that feel roughly the same. So instead of knocking somebody unconscious, you stun them. And when they're stunned, either they can't do anything and there's a special stun thing that they know is going away. There's like a bar going, yoop, and then they're unstunned. Or while they're stunned, they attack at penalty and defend at penalty. Instead of paralysis completely stopping someone, you just slow them down. They move slower. They attack slower. It's understood. It's an effect the player can live with, but they're not actually paralyzed. Similarly with charm, players don't like having their control taken away, but you can kind of do the same thing if you're saying, I want you to fight for me. You could throw a spell that the boss now has an immunity shield on. The player can't attack them. So this is a good time for the player to, buff their companions, to heal, but attacking the boss right now isn't going to work. For stealing items, I never found a way of doing that players accepted. We allowed it. There were the little kids in the Den of Iniquity in Fallout 2, which I'll say I designed this. They stole from the player. Player hated it. Player absolutely hated it. I'm not sure I've ever played a game where NPCs could steal from me and I liked it. If you guys have seen it, let me know. Now, if you do allow some of these effects on NPCs, you might say, knocking unconscious, paralyzing, charming. You might allow the really powerful boss ones to use the PC rules instead. So an ability that would normally knock out an NPC will only stun a boss. I think players get it. That they understand that sometimes bosses have that same division in the world that players do. And I think that if you make a divide between player and NPC, it's fair to do that for bosses. And players who complain, you're like, hey, you can't get knocked unconscious. I don't think it's a far jump to say this really powerful NPC boss can't be knocked unconscious. So that's a long video. Let me conclude. Let me wrap this up. I recommend that you make the same rules for players and NPCs, except for the few player unavoidable ones like pausing and save games and a few I mentioned. And it's okay if you make a special ability or two, which is something that only the player can do and no one else can, especially if the setting or story explains that specialness. And by the way, you did do your setting and story first, right? Before you did the mechanics. I always recommend that. Second, I would try to avoid having special rules for skills. that work differently on players or versus the environment, if you can, because that's another way that people feel that division. This may mean avoiding some effects. You may not have paralysis. You only have stun or slow. Fine. But I think trying to minimize that division is a good goal to have, as long as you're aware you can never probably entirely eliminate it. So, Shy Robot, I hope that answers your question.